There is a fifth dimension,
about the unknown,
beyond that which is known to man.
The Garden of Thought.
The Babylon Project was our last best hope for peace.
Unexplained.
Mythologies.
This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call
The Garden of Thought with Jeff Lippman.
Eventually, our sun will grow cold and go out.
You're listening to something much bigger, something hidden in plain sight.
It won't just take us. It'll take Marilyn Monroe and Lao Tzu and Einstein. All of us was for nothing unless we go to the stars.
What you're about to learn will completely change the way you experience your mind, your thoughts, and yourself.
Let's make sure that history never forgets the name.
The Garden of Thought.
Welcome, everyone, into the Garden of Thought. Welcoming back Poet Laureate, author, lawyer, friend, Jennifer Sutherland to the show. And we're going to, not in time for Christmas scariness, but maybe in time for New Year's, who knows. But whatever it is, it'll be in the cold of winter when the days are short and the nights are long. We're going to talk about fairy tales. I was going to say twisted fairy tales, but the truth is, all fairy tales are twisted. Maybe not the versions that we saw we're familiar with, but they're twisted. But luckily, Jennifer's here to give us the truth, to twist them up for us, and hopefully give you and your kids nightmares at night. What do you think, Jen?
These fairy tales will give you nightmares.
Excellent. This is great. This is fantastic. I need something to fill me up. I watched Welcome to Derry. I'm sort of watching Stranger Things. People are preparing me for disappointment. Okay, fine. I watched Castle Rock. I like that. So, I want some spooky stuff. I want some spooky good stuff. So, I guess before we get into that, though, people who, if they're not longtime listeners of the show and not giant fans of yours, maybe we should tell them who you are. And by we, I mean you.
I don't know that I have any giant fans. I would love to have giant fans. I am a poet. My second book is due out this spring. It's called House of Myth and Necessity. And it is a collection of poems about the Greek myth of Alcestis, which I won't go into depth about, but it's a great story about a woman who dies and comes back from the dead. And it's about a marriage and all of the ways that we hurt each other as human beings. So, light reading.
Of course.
And my
is Alcestis somehow related to the Odyssey?
No.
Okay.
Alcestis is a totally different story. Takes place, within the sort of the Greek kingdoms that you would recognize. She is the queen to a king named Admetus. And Admetus, and I am now telling you the Alcestis story.
It's okay.
Admetus finds out that he's going to die. And he happens to be a good friend of the god Apollo, which is a good friend to have. If you're going to have a friend,
sure.
Why should it not be Apollo?
Right.
And Apollo really likes Admetus. They're good friends. Admetus had at one point done him a favor, and he wants to do Admetus a favor back. So he goes to Hades and says, hey, if my friend can find someone who will die instead of him, would that be okay with you? And Hades says, sure, why not? then the problem becomes who's going to do it.
Right.
And Admetus goes to his parents, both of whom refuse. And there's in the play, which is by Euripides, there's this great scene between Admetus and his father, both of them calling each other cowards, basically, because neither one of them want to die.
Right.
And at the end of the day, Alcestis decides that she'll step up and do it.
Of course.
And
this is a Greek tragedy after the way, right?
Well, it's a Euripidean tragedy, and if you know anything about Euripides, there's a twist. It's never straightforward. He's like the Robert Frost of the Greek playwrights, in the sense that you think you're reading one play and really it's something completely different. So you think that this is a play about a woman making this sort of heroic choice to die and allow her husband to live, but it's also maybe a little bit about the societal structures that trap people and the things that people will do to escape that. Anyway, Alcestis dies and she goes off with Thanatos to the underworld. And in the meantime, and this again is classic Euripides, who was always just throwing things at you that you didn't expect. In the meantime, Hercules, the big strongman guy, shows up at the house. And he thinks that he's there for a party. And Admetus, who is a good host, throws him a party. They sit around and they drink, and Hercules does not notice at all that there's been a death in the house until eventually, I think, a servant sort of starts to cry, and he realizes that something is off, and he starts asking questions. And when he finds out that this has happened, being Hercules, he goes down into the underworld and he brings Alcestis back. And he presents her to her husband, who has, before she died, promised that he would never take another wife. And there's a very strange scene at the end of the play where Admetus is looking at this woman who's wearing a veil, as one does when one comes back from the grave, and doesn't recognize his wife yet.
Right.
And has to be sort of convinced to take her back. And she doesn't say anything. And the play just kind of ends there. And Euripides left it to the people in the audience to kind of figure out what to think about all of that. And different people have thought lots of different things about it.
Okay. Well, the first thing I think is Apollo is like only half useful as a god. Like he couldn't find like the world's worst person or somebody that was like in like the Greek equivalent of hospice and like, put them in. No, he does half the job. The other thing is Hercules can't really see beyond himself most of the time anyway. So he's always going to be bumbling around and looking for a party and, trying to do something, afterwards to make him seem like a hero, not a big buffoon, but he's mostly a buffoon. And I'm just going to go with the guy had glaucoma, couldn't see. I guess people could say death changes you, or maybe, she deteriorated. What's the word when people say? I don't know why I can't think of this word, but
Rot.
Well, yeah, rot. There's a more famous word for it than rot, or a more appropriate word, but that's all right. We'll go with rot. I don't need to spend 10 minutes trying to search for the right word. And so, sort of like what happened to like Hel, Hel, when she went to, hell and, like half her face sort of like, drooped and turned into like, ghoulish skeleton, mess. Maybe it's like she saw like the Holy Grail and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And, I don't know, but there was that movie Death Becomes Her. Maybe death just didn't become her. I don't know. The funny thing is, I used to know a lawyer whose last name was Euripides. So of course, every time I saw him, I said, "Hey, where's Aeschylus?" and whatever other names of Greek playwrights I can think of to insinuate they were, of course, his partners, and of course they were all his bosses. They had to be, because that's the way it went. Anyway, he clearly had never heard any of those jokes before, and then thought I was just. Basically, he thought I was Hercules at the party without the muscles. All right. So we got the myth. And yes, listen, I'm always happy to hear a Greek myth because there's so many of them. And I asked about Odysseus because I was watching a bunch of stuff on Odysseus on the Odyssey, and there's so many names just like the ones you said and like everyone is intertwined there. Probably not accidentally. I thought that maybe there was a chance, but I've come to realize that Odysseus, sort of a piece of shit. So, and not just for the reasons that I'd come to like way back when, when I first realized that the Trojans were the good guys and the Greeks were the bad guys. But yeah, I'm interested to see what Christopher Nolan does with this movie because Odysseus, yeah,
he's a liar. Yeah, I mean he is an accomplished liar and deceiver.
Yeah, he's good at everything except being good consistently. I don't know. It's like I'm trying to figure out the words too, but you're a poet. Maybe you'll help me with this. And I don't expect you to know the answer to this now or even see the same parallel. But I sort of feel like the Old Testament stole the story of Job and Exodus from the Odyssey, except they changed it from being Greek to like the Jewish version. And so, of course, Moses does everything right, but everyone else is doing things wrong all the time. And like Odysseus had to go through all this peril and whatever, but mostly his own fault. But at the end, he sort of got something good, at least at the end of this story. I'm sure there's a sequel where he loses everything tragically because that's Greek mythology as well. But Job, his first 70 years sucked basically. And then his second 70 years, we're pretty good. And he got everything like, threefold or whatever it was. So I kind of think I'm working on this parallel of the Old Testament and the Odyssey, just from, different versions of what is the idyllic, now. Like Greek, it's like very Viking. It's like we conquer, we win. It doesn't really matter how we do it. Winning and the fortune and the fame is the more important thing. And so like Jewish is like, we study Torah and we obey God and, sacrifice goats and, and then we're doing a thing. They both sacrifice goats. So I don't know. Maybe I planted something interesting in your head, or maybe, as I often say when I'm talking to actual, professors and stuff like that, I go, you realize, sir, you're talking to an idiot right now. So, and sometimes they go, well, hopefully your audience is not full of idiots. And I'm always like, let's hope. So anyway, so let's go to the twisted fairy tales, before you have a aneurysm from my Old Testament Odyssey little parallel there.
I actually think that is a great segue into talking about fairy tales and what they are and where they come from. Because what are they? I mean, we have these great ancient epics like the Odyssey, like Gilgamesh, which is another ancient epic poem about a king going out and doing quests and trying to live forever and failing at that task. Fairy tales aren't like that. They're stories that they tend to involve characters who aren't royal or noble, or if they are, then they're in disguise. We don't recognize them necessarily as princesses or princes. Maybe they're living under a curse that has been placed on them by a witch at birth. There might be dragons. There might be other sorts of fantastical creatures, elves, dwarves,
witches.
Animals might talk. There are all of these sorts of folk elements because these are stories that people told each other. They sat around the fire in the evenings and they told stories. And sometimes the stories were intended to impart some kind of message, some kind of wisdom, a warning. Oftentimes, a lot of these stories are warning young girls about men. Wow. A lot of these stories are warning young girls about men. But they're also warning people to sort of be aware of appearances and not to take appearances as the truth. So there's all of this sort of folk wisdom that is encoded in these stories that get told generation to generation to generation in very informal ways. The stories get embellished upon over time. They change here and there. They might look different told in a part of France than told in a part of Germany. And for a long time, these stories were just that. They were just stories that were told. And sometime around the late 17th century, it did not hurt that the printing press was invented, right? Sometime around the late 17th century, people started to publish some of these stories as stories that were meant to be read and preserved in book form. And one of the first of those was the story of Beauty and the Beast. And then in the next century, in the 18th century, you had people like the Brothers Grimm, who went out and collected stories from the countryside, from people who lived in the country and who told these stories. This was a time when we were developing sort of the sense of the nation state and what it is. What did it mean? I mean, Germany was a collection of, 25 different kingdoms and
at least
provinces. But people were figuring out, what does it mean to be a German or a Hanoverian or a French person?
Bohemian.
And a Bohemian. What did that mean? What did that look like? And one of the ways of sort of capturing that sense of national identity was to collect the stories that were traditionally told by the people who lived in these places. So you had the Brothers Grimm. In France, you had Charles Perrault. That's my terrible French pronunciation of his name. Who he published. Well, he was one of the first to publish a bunch of the stories that we recognize now. Puss in Boots. I think he published a version of Snow White. I think he published a version of Beauty and the Beast and Red Riding Hood. These stories that have come down to us and have since been Disneyfied.
Yes.
And I don't even want to talk about Disney because the Disney versions of these stories are exactly that. They're Disney versions, and they take many of the most interesting elements, I think, of these stories, and they sanitize them out. And so you get a Snow White who we're going to talk about that story, I think, today. You get a Snow White who is not at all grim and bloody. And really, this is a grim, horrifying story about what people will do to each other in order to compete. And then in the late 70s, maybe the 1960s and the 1970s, there was sort of a renewed interest in many of these stories that was born by feminism and by the various other kinds of ism-driven studies that took hold in many universities. And people were going back to these stories and looking for elements that had maybe not been looked at as closely before, and republishing them, publishing analyses of them, publishing new takes on them. And one of them, maybe the most famous, is a collection of stories called The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, who was an English fiction writer, completely brilliant, and absolutely remains very much worth reading today. If you like writers like Kelly Link, who writes in the science fiction, fantasy space, Kelly Link looks to Angela Carter as someone who influenced her very much when she was starting to write. So Angela Carter in this collection of stories takes many of these stories like Red Riding Hood and finds in them the stuff that has been left out, the sex, the blood, the death, the grimness, the occasional grimness of human existence, and she puts them back in.
The TVMA. I'm listening. I'm interested. So this is not like the Pooh, Blood and Honey version. This is actually going back to the old roots, which were horrific enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, people get eaten by wolves That is a thing that happened if you lived in villages on the edge of forests. And that doesn't show up really in Snow White, the Disney version.
No.
But that's part of the story.
The closest we get is the Jungle Book, I think.
So I thought we could start by looking at an English translation of a poem by the German poet Goethe.
Okay. I've heard of Goethe.
Yes. And this poem, it's, not as famous today, probably, but it was at one time very famous. If you think of the most famous American poem, you can think of like maybe something like Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening or The Road Not Taken, something like that. This was a poem that children knew and could recite and learned in school and would be read around a fire, just like, we sort of sit around and watch television now. This would have been entertainment poetry. And you probably can't hear it as well in the English translation as you can in the German, which I cannot read. There are people who could read it in the original German, and I envy them. But one of the things that Goethe does in this poem is he establishes a cadence or a rhythm to the sound that sounds like a horse's galloping.
Do you think that our mutual friend, Mr. Godfrey, does cameos and we could teach him how to do it in German in this cadence? Because I think that would be fantastic.
I think he probably could.
I think he could too.
And he might, yeah.
Yes,
he's corrected my pronunciation once or twice.
Yes, you should send that. You should send that to all your friends next Christmas. And instead of a Christmas card, you give his restless. All right, let's move on. Shut up, Jeff. Let's no inside jokes here. Let's well, I'm not really joking. But let's hear it. Let's hear some Goethe.
All right, so this is called the Earl King. The Earl you could also read as elf. This is the king of the elves, and when I think about who this figure is, I don't think about the Santa Claus elves, the little fellows with their little tools in the toy shop. These are not those kinds of elves. These are much more like the elves that you might find in like the Lord of the Rings or something like that. They're human-sized or larger. And they're magical and not necessarily dedicated to doing you good.
All right. I've got Lord Arwen locked and loaded right now.
Okay. The Earl King. Who rides there so late through the night, dark and drear? The father it is, with his infant so dear. He holdeth the boy tightly clasped in his arm. He holdeth him safely. He keepeth him warm. My son, wherefore seekest thou thy face thus to hide? Look, father, the Earl King is close by our side. Dost see not the Earl King with crown and with train? My son, 'tis the mist rising over the plain. O come, thou dear infant, O come thou with me. Full many a game I will play there with thee. On my strand, lovely flowers their blossoms unfold. My mother shall grace thee with garments of gold. My father, and dost thou not hear the words that the Earl King now breathes in mine ear? Be calm, dearest child, 'tis thy fancy deceives. 'Tis the sad wind that sighs through the withering leaves. Wilt go then, dear infant, wilt go with me there? My daughters shall tend thee with sisterly care. My daughters by night their glad festival keep. They'll dance thee and rock thee and sing thee to sleep. My father, and dost thou not see how the Earl King his daughters has brought here for me? My darling, I see it aright. 'Tis the aged grey willows deceiving thy sight. I love thee, I am charmed by thy beauty, dear boy, and if thou art unwilling, then force I'll employ. My father, he seizes me fast, Full sorely the Earl King has hurt me at last. The father now gallops, with terror half wild. He grasps in his arms the poor shuddering child. He reaches his courtyard with toil and with dread. The child in his arms finds he motionless, dead.
I figured.
So that's the poem.
Yeah, it's sounds a little bit sinister. So I wasn't really sure until I'm still not sure, but it's not like the father was like, trying to tell the kid, tisk, nothing's happening here, but he was knowingly bringing the child to his death or was sacrificing the child. But at the end, I'm not so sure. I think the child was going through their own experience and the father was trying to bring him home, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of that's part of why fairy tales survive the way that they do, is they don't necessarily give you a clear answer.
Yeah.
And you might tell them a different way in order to try and answer questions you have, and then you might generate more questions along the way. So I think that's part of what gives them their power. But the story is generally sort of understood. This is a father whose child is ill. He's maybe rushing him home. He's rushing him to a doctor, might be rushing him to his mother's house. And they're riding really fast on a horse through the forest. And the child is saying to his father, do you hear the Earl King? He's whispering in my ear. He's saying, you should come with me. You should come with me and I'll give you this lovely life. But you can imagine sort of what the Earl King would look like to this child who is ill. This is not, again, one of Santa's elves. This is like a towering, frightening figure who is saying that he's going to take the child away. And meanwhile, the father is telling his child, no, it's nothing. It's the willows. It's the willows. It's the trees all around you. It's the wind.
Right. And both could be true.
Mm-hmm.
And probably the next scene.
We don't know if the father knows sort of what's going on. If the father understands that this is an issue, we don't know any of these things.
Or if he did something to make it too late. I want the next scene where the mother is. Yes, I'm sure she'll know what's going on, and she would tell us.
Maybe. Or she comes out and she finds the bundle with the child, and the child's already gone. And these are the sorts of things that kids would ask questions about. They would ask questions and people would make up their answers. And maybe that was one way that you taught your children. This was a time when, half of your children or more might not make it to adulthood.
Right. Yeah, I guess that could be. It could be, or maybe we're saying, don't go too far that you can't get home on your own at night. It could be a missive of that. But who knows? Who knows? It could be, as you put it, depending on the tenor and the inflection and what you put the emphasis on, it could be, you could retrofit it to whatever use that perhaps you want to use it for. But yeah, a little ominous, a little bittersweet, but I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have done Lord Arwen. Maybe I should have done a darker elf.
Or Arwen is a woman.
I thought Arwen was the dad. Who was
No, the dad is begins with an E. Oh, all right, hold on. Now I need to remind myself.
Yeah, the guy who was the Red Skull, and he also the Mr. Jones in the
Elrond.
Elrond, okay.
Father, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Arwen was Liv Tyler. Now yeah. No, if she was calling I think a child of any age would be rocking that.
Yeah, well, those of us who have read the books and care about the books were irritated with the whole Arwen character in the movies. But that's a whole other story.
Where were you a few weeks ago when I did a Lord of the Rings show with someone? My guy didn't mention that at all, but we were talking about the movies more than we were talking about the books.
Yeah, the movies are great. The movies are great, but it's definitely sort of a Hollywood gloss on some of what's going on in the books.
I'm sure that's true. I mean, it was decades since I read the book, so it seemed pretty close to me, but what do I know? All right. Anyway, that's a different sort of fairy tale altogether. All right. So let's go into some of these undisneyfied, familiar stories that the world knows about, but maybe knows not what they were fed.
All right. So let's talk about Snow White. The plot of the story that we know from Disney mostly comes from Grimm. And keep in mind too that there were several versions of Grimm's collections of these fairy tales. They would go out and they would collect the stories, and then maybe 10 or 15 years later, they would put together a new edition, and that would have more stories in it. In one of the later editions, they actually named one of their storytellers and had a portrait painted of her or sketched of her to appear in the edition to sort of show one of their sources. And this was just, an old woman from a village who had told them stories that she had heard since she was a child, and that the Grimm brothers published. Snow White is maybe one of the more famous of the stories that they put together and published, and we have to expect that the story as they published it probably came from different sources. Different people might have included different elements of the story. One story might have had a queen, another story it might have just been an evil witch. I mean, who knows?
Right.
But the version that we have is the version that was compiled by the Grimm brothers. And in that version, again, it starts out like the one that we remember. There is a queen who sits at a window. It's the winter time. She's sewing. She accidentally pricks her finger, and 3 drops of blood drip on the freshly fallen snow. And when she sees the red against the snow, she thinks how beautiful that is, and how much she would like to have a child who looks like that, who has skin as white as snow, her lips are as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. And then she gets pregnant, and she has a child, and she names that child Snow White. And then she dies, conveniently. Her father, who is the king, decides to remarry. And he remarries a woman who is very beautiful, but she is also very evil. The evil stepmother. And that's a figure who turns up all of the time in these stories. Because one of the things that is frightening, obviously, when you're a child, is the idea, number one, that one of your parents might die, especially your mother, and that your mother might be replaced by someone who doesn't love you.
Right. Your status in the household and your role is different.
Sure. And there were anxieties reflected in these stories, not just about losing a parent, but about losing a ruler. What happens if the king dies? What happens if you have a queen and the queen marries a man? I mean, that was something that played out during the Tudor era, obviously. And all of these sorts of anxieties are in these stories.
Yeah, has a boy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we all know that boys rule and girls drool.
Exactly.
Right. Or at least during this period of time.
So the evil stepmother who marries Snow White's father has a magic mirror, another sort of magical element that turns up a lot. There are mirrors that you can see in. There's a magic mirror device in the Beauty and the Beast story. In this particular mirror, she sees someone who will answer her questions, or a very specific question, which is whether or not she is the most beautiful person in the kingdom, which is an anxiety about power for women who get to exercise power or status based on how attractive they are. To be the most beautiful in the land was the key to retaining your status, to all of these wonderful possessions that you had, to your right to sit on the throne. And the mirror would always answer the queen that, yes, you are the fairest person in the land. Until Snow White was a young girl. And by that time, she was beginning to show that she was going to be a very beautiful girl. And one day the queen asked her magic mirror whether or not she was the most beautiful in the land. And the mirror said no, which would have been like frightening and shocking and terrifying, and told her that, in fact, Snow White was now the most beautiful girl in the land.
Yes, the worst change to her daily routine she could imagine.
Mm-hmm. Because now she has to be afraid. And there's all sorts of weird incestuous stuff encoded in these stories too. I mean, there just is. There's all of these stories of women being afraid of daughters, of being replaced by their daughters. And even though this is a stepmother, that there's that element here as well. There is a risk that is represented to her by the fact that her stepdaughter is now more beautiful than she is.
Well, that's not unprecedented in stories. I mean, maybe more famously on the male side of things, but hey, fair's fair. Maybe it's that the girls rule and the boys rule time, because, the women have the same fear. But I mean, talk about Greek mythology. Every father was worried about his son at some point, and at least half the time he was right to be.
Sure. I mean, yeah. So the queen from that point starts to try and come up with ideas for killing Snow White, to eliminate the threat to her rule. And eventually she finds a huntsman, which is a character. You sort of think of this person being like a freelance, like, guy who goes out and hunts for deer or something. I don't know. But she finds a huntsman and says, take Snow White into the forest and kill her. And you can prove to me that you have killed her by bringing me, like, her body parts.
I mean, we've all seen this the greasy, grimy character in this, but for the purposes of entertainment, I have inserted Danny Trejo Machete as my huntsman.
Okay. And that would be like a good huntsman, because Danny has, I mean, whether we choose to see it or not, he has a heart of gold.
I'm sure. He's an actor.
And he has a great taco restaurant, I am told. So the huntsman goes out.
Who would tell him otherwise?
The woods. Sorry?
Who would tell him otherwise?
Well, probably.
I mean, he's killed people in every way you could possibly imagine, and ways that you couldn't possibly imagine.
You're probably not going to send your food back to the kitchen.
No.
So the huntsman takes Snow White out into the woods. He sort of takes a step back and raises his knife up in the air to plunge it down into her heart. And she realizes that he is about to kill her. And she begs him, no, please don't kill me. I'll run away. You'll never see me again. And he says, all right, go ahead. And instead he kills, I think, a deer or a boar. And he brings the boar's lungs and liver back to the queen and says, look, here it is. I've killed her. This is the proof. I feel like an animal's liver would not be the same size as a young girl's, but
I don't know. I mean, they do they use pig organs for human transplants. So actually, it seems like that's a pretty good, maybe it was like maybe it was an adolescent boar. I mean, so,
that's true. You were probably right.
So he did sort of have a heart of gold, or at least he didn't have a complete heart of stone.
He didn't want to kill a girl. I mean, it might have been a different story if he'd been sent out to kill another man, but he was not willing to kill a young girl.
I get it, but we only have the facts before us, and he didn't do the horrible deed. I mean, he did leave what I presume to be like a 12-year-old in the woods by herself, but
yes, well, there's that.
Yeah, I mean,
and a lot of these stories, there is this sort of abdication of responsibility of leaving things up to fate. If you think of Hansel and Gretel, which is another sort of really horrifying story, that's the story of parents abandoning their children in the woods to take care of themselves, and they wound up being preyed upon by a witch. I mean, that is a horrifying story. but there's a sense of leaving things up to fate. If I don't myself do it, then what happens to these children or to these people is not my responsibility. And again, if you're living in sort of these very, very harsh places, harsh times, and the difference between staying alive might be whether or not you're feeding 6 people or 3 people, sometimes these kinds of decisions maybe had to be made. And they wound up being turned into stories like this.
Yeah, that's definitely true. But I mean, it also, I mean, there's a long history of stories with this theme, and I would imagine some of them made it up to, Europe in the whatever the was this the. It's not quite the Renaissance. Is it around the Renaissance Enlightenment time? So they say 1500s.
That's when they started to be published, but they were telling these stories probably for centuries before then.
Right. So they would know Jason and the Argonauts, how Jason was left in the forest, basically the same kind of thing. They would know that Moses' mother left her in a reed, a basket on the Nile, and they might even know that Sargon's mother did the same thing in what was to become Sumeria, a couple thousand years before that as well. The old, and I'm sure there were plenty. I mean, I think wasn't like Zeus scurried away and hidden on Crete or some island where a she-wolf raised him or nurtured him. So when he was being hidden from, the mother, Rhea, gave Kronos a rock. And I guess since gods are so hard, you don't know that your god baby, the texture is basically the same as a rock. And I guess he wasn't doing it for the flavor. And she sent Zeus with some other, goddess or nymph or something who was in league with her, and they took him to a cave on some island where, a she-wolf, milked him and made him strong. Anyway, so yeah, this is a trope that predate. It's not just these Europeans. It's not even just Europeans. The Moses stories in Egypt, which is, Africa, and the Sargon stories in Mesopotamia, which is in Asia. So, I once read a book. Actually, I read this book twice. So I twice read this book, who said that the roots of that you've all heard the Cinderella story in the Tale of Osiris. I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? And apparently when Osiris was chopped up into however many pieces, 14, I think is the usual number, that at some point his sister and lover, Isis, went all over the place. And at some point she went to Jordan and inserted herself into a royal house, because that's where the piece of Osiris was, and was like a serving girl. And so basically she was Cinderella until she didn't try to get a glass slipper. She steal away with, Osiris. I don't know if this was the golden penis part or not. I think that was fashioned by maybe Anubis or something. But any excuse to say golden penis is an opportunity to take. So golden penis. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, now I'm not really sure if that is the Cinderella route or not. This book I read was on esotericism, so some of the symbology, sometimes you reach a little and you make the symbology fit your narrative. But I don't know that it's not either. I mean, it struck me as very interesting when I first heard it. I'm like, wow, a light bulb went off. And as I'm like, wow. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so yeah.
Well, I mean, who is the guy in Greek myth who got served his family? Is that, or he cooked up his family and served them to dinner? Was that Tantalus?
No, it was Lycianus or Lycanus who gave Zeus a bum meal. He sacrificed like the wrong cow or something to him or whatever, and tried to trick him. So then Zeus served him his own kids and then turned him into a wolf.
Okay. Well, again, these stories leading into one another.
Just like Walder Frey in Game of Thrones.
Yeah. and that was very intentional on his part. I mean, he's doing all of that intentionally.
Oh yeah.
Which can I just say, it irritated me so much that people hated the ending of the show. Because I think if you saw what he was doing, which was he was turning all of these fantasy tropes on their head, that was the only way it could end. I mean, the heroine could only debase herself, and the kid who no one thought was capable of leading could only become the leader.
Fantasy tropes. Exactly what makes those controversial endings so fascinating.
I've said something to make Alexa talk to me.
Yeah, I'm like, holy Megan Fox, Batman, is that companion next to you? Is that Sophie Thatcher? I mean, what's?
Alexa is answering something about Greek mythology, so I don't know.
I'm like that smart woman in your room sounds very robotic.
Yeah, I'm going to unplug her.
It's the Oracle of Apple. So yeah, all right. No, anyway. Absolutely. Now, Game of Thrones we can do another time, because I'm not sure that ending was his ending. In fact, I'm sure it's not his ending because he hasn't written his ending yet. So, right. But yeah, I mean,
I didn't hate the ending. I know as much as I know a lot of fans really hated it, because to me it made sense, at least in terms of what I thought he was trying to do with that story.
It's funny you mention it, because I saw. Okay, so I get insomnia, like usually once a week, and I watch a bunch of YouTube videos, and I saw something like the 10 most terrifying stories in the Bible, and at least 3 of them were lifted in Game of Thrones. So I mean, yeah, right in there.
Yeah, I mean, part of what he was doing was playing with sort of the palimpsest. The textedness of these stories, and how one text would kind of build on the next text, would build on the next text.
Oh my God, just say praxis and polemic and just totally use them properly in sentences and totally show off.
But the reason that I asked who was the guy whose family got served to him at dinner is because that's what happens next in Snow White. Is the queen has the cook the lungs and liver that she believes have come to her from the body of Snow White, and has them at dinner. And you have to believe that meant that her husband, Snow White's father, was also eating these parts.
Right.
So she was feeding his daughter, or that she believed that she was feeding the daughter to the father.
Right. Essence de snow.
Which Freud, I think, would have much to say about. But Snow White, in the meantime, was still alive, and she wanders through the forest, and she comes to, and this is the Disneyfied part, she comes to a cottage where there are 7 dwarves living, and these dwarves, I always, in my mind, I prefer to picture, again, sort of the Lord of the Rings dwarves as opposed to the Disney dwarves.
Right, coal miners.
Because I want them to be. Did you say hold on?
No, I said coal miners,
Oh, yeah. And sort of rough, people who live underground and don't have good table manners.
Right.
She lets herself in, she eats their food, she drinks their wine, she tries sleeping in all of their beds. Right now, this all feels very Goldilocks-y. She falls asleep in one of the beds, and then the dwarves come home, and they realize that she is in their house because she has not been a very good guest. She's left drawers pulled open and things lying around on the floor. And they head upstairs and they discover her in the bed. And she wakes up and she tells them what's happened and the fact that her stepmother has tried to kill her. And they, I guess, completely forget about the fact that this person has broken into their house and eaten their food and drunk their wine or drunk their milk or whatever it is that dwarves drink. And so they say, well, you can stay here. You just have to clean up. You're going to work from us.
Earn your keep.
She goes from being a princess now to a housemaid, which
it could have been worse. If you are a young, most beautiful woman in the land, and you stumble into 7 miners' home, and it's just the 7 are living together, letting you stay there and own your room and board just by cleaning up, I mean, is not the worst of conditions.
There are probably versions of the story that floated around that involved her doing worse things. Because, this would have been a story that you might have told your children and warned them not to be too rebellious, because if you're too rebellious, you wind up working in a brothel.
Right.
And that may well have been a version of a story that the Grimm brothers decided not to tell. So anyway, so she spends her time cleaning up for the dwarves and working around the house and whistling while she works. And they continue going off and working in the mines. And the queen goes back to her magic mirror, and she is fully expecting that the mirror is going to tell her that she is once again the fairest in the land. But the mirror does not do that, because the mirror tells the truth. And it tells her that Snow White is still the fairest in the land. But also, because the mirror is a snitch, it tells her where Snow White is, which says that she's living in the house with the dwarves in the forest. And the queen realizes that if you want to get something done, you have to do it yourself. And she decides that she will go and kill Snow White herself. So she goes into the forest, she dresses up like an old beggar woman. And then this is the part where the story diverges a little bit from the cartoon version. She brings several different gifts. It's not just the apple. First, she offers Snow White a bodice that she can wear. A bodice is like a girdle. It would make your waist very thin. You pull on the laces tight to make your waist get smaller. And the queen laces her up in the bodice so tightly that Snow White can't breathe and she faints.
Okay.
But the seven dwarves then return just in time, and they loosen the laces. And certainly there is something to be said there about the lengths that women will go to suit certain standards of beauty. So the queen tries again, and she shows up at the door next selling combs, and she offers Snow White a comb as a present, and the comb, unfortunately, has been treated with poison.
Of course.
Snow White brushes her hair, the poison overcomes her, and she collapses. But again, the dwarves get home just in time to save her by pulling the comb out of her hair. And then finally, the queen tries again, and this time she brings the apple that is poisoned. And she hands it to her, and Snow White, who has learned nothing from the two previous encounters with strangers coming to the door offering her gifts, takes a bite out of the apple and then collapses. And the queen thinks finally that the girl is dead and goes off to have another celebration. But the dwarves again get home just in time, and you sort of wonder why at a certain point they didn't just leave one of them at home with this girl who does not learn not to open the door.
Even simpler, I'm just wondering why the queen didn't vary up her schedule and show up a couple hours earlier. It's like
Well, I mean, all of these things are dependent on fate and chance, and I think people were very interested in sort of these ideas of agency and fate. We don't give people the credit that they deserve for understanding how life works.
Fate is inexorable. Just, yes, I get it, the Norns and all of that, sure. Got it. Still, I think if the queen just showed up a few hours earlier, I'm guessing the dwarves were a little bit like Fred Flintstone or the sheepdog on Looney Tunes. Clocked in, same time every day. Clocked out, same time every day. Maybe a little variation, for solstice and, solstice or solstices. But not very clever. But listen, she's a villain. She's not supposed to be all that clever. Clearly, the girl wasn't all that bright either. Kept opening the door and accepting things from... And listen, we all know if one is disguised as a beggar, you cannot possibly see through that. Thor dressed up as a woman. Odysseus again dressed up as a beggar as well. I guess he had some Athena help there sometimes. But yeah, I mean, nobody can possibly see through this. I mean, in Obi-Wan, we saw that as soon as Obi-Wan Kenobi put his hood on, he could speak as patrician as he wanted. He still could pass as a day worker.
Or you could read this as being a story about choices.
Oh, okay. Well, we could do that too.
Yeah, I mean, Snow White has the choice to open the door, and she doesn't have to open the door, but she does.
She's open-hearted.
So, or stupid. I mean, it's...
I thought you were trying to take me away from the Snow White is stupid line.
Well, I think Snow White is being utilized to convey a message, to think critically before you accept the apple that is offered to you from the witch's basket or on social media.
Yes.
Anyway,
and she is a naive young girl, although she has survived at this point 3 attempts on her life, and you think that would have wisened, but stop overthinking it, Jeff. It's a story.
Right.
Snow is snow. She's pure.
So the dwarves get home. They find her collapsed on the floor. They think that she's dead. They put her in the famous glass coffin that we see in the cartoon. And there she stays. And she stays there for a while. Although she doesn't decompose, she doesn't wake up. She's just in this sort of state of suspended animation.
Right.
And eventually a prince comes along and finds her very beautiful. She's now, I guess, grown from a young girl to an adult. I guess the glass coffin grew with her, or maybe they replaced her. They replaced the glass coffin and she grew.
And gave her a complete exercise routine so that she had an excellent body and could fit into that bodice. Yeah.
She wasn't eating, so.
Well, she also wasn't wasting away. I mean, she came out like Jane Fonda, or
yeah.
In honor of the recent death, she came out like Bridget Bardot. We'll go with it.
The prince kisses her, and she comes back to life. Although there's some of the stories, when he kisses her, she chokes and she spits up a piece of the poisoned apple that's been lodged in her throat all of this time. So that evil that had been lodged inside of her by the witch queen, the evil stepmother, has been ejected, and she's returned to her innocence and her purity. And they get married. They announce that they're going to get married.
She expelled the bad seed. Literally, she expelled the bad seed. So Cinderella, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty are all basically the same story.
They share all of these different elements, yeah. And there's probably, if you go far enough back in time, there's probably some uber story, some story that lies at the heart of all of them, and that changed and evolved over time and in different families and different places, and became these different sort of branch stories that all owe their origin to the same one.
So do you think that the not to be too Campbellian, but I'm going to go there, that the hero's journey that involves that you have to go to the underworld and survive death, where in men it's a very one way, and in some cases a woman gets rescued by a hero, or maybe in the female way, you just have to survive long enough for a man to kiss you, as opposed to make a deal with Hades or Hades quite a bit, or whoever else. It's basically the hero's journey, but they just have to sort of stay in stasis until they get kissed by the right dude.
That's one reading. This story though is told from the viewpoint of Snow White. She is the apparent hero in the story, not the prince who eventually comes and rescues her. She's the central character, the hero, and I don't know. I don't know what to make of the fact that she remains sort of sleeping or in a coma or whatever it is that she is until a prince happens along and kisses her.
Well, it's not unusual in the older stories where it's the woman. I mean, again, Isis rescued Osiris. Inanna went to rescue. I think it was it Marduk No, rescued? I'm not sure. Or maybe it was Baal. No, she rescued Baal. It was in the Baal cycle.
Those are stories where the female character is more clearly a hero and making a sort of heroic choice. We talked about Alcestis at the beginning, and Alcestis is really the clear, as clear as anything is in Euripides, is the clear sort of central character, the heroine of that story. But the writers, the tellers of these stories are leaving some space for men to come along and play a role that seems to be important to the tellers of these stories.
Yeah, Demeter and Persephone, it really took a village in that one.
Well, Persephone is rescued by her mother.
Yeah, but also, Hades made a deal, did a little trick, some seeds involved there as well. I mean, Orpheus was sort of involved. I think Zeus said, "Okay, go get her." I mean, I think there were a few people involved.
Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it's her mother who goes and gets her.
Oh, sure. Well, moms. We've seen that. Remember the Incredible Hulk when David Banner was studying and moms lifting cars to save their kids and stuff.
Say that again?
You don't remember the old Incredible Hulk show, like from 1980, where David Banner was studying.
You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
Exactly, yeah. And there was this whole thing like in the late 70s, early 80s, where like people had super strength when they were in danger, and there was always a bunch of like moms fighting off cougars or lifting cars when their children were. I mean, I'm sure none of these things ever happened, but I was sure they were. I was sure they happened. Just like I was sure that there were scorpions, rattlesnakes, and quicksand everywhere.
Well, I mean, think about what was going on in the late 70s, early 80s, when you had stories like The Incredible Hulk, or like The Bionic Man, or The Bionic Woman, The Greatest American Hero, even, maybe. We were coming out, or we were stuck in or coming out of a period of malaise. Everything was expensive. People couldn't afford to buy gas. We were very stuck.
Like now.
We were stuck. Right. Yeah. So people, at different times, people imagine stories for themselves in which characters who look and feel like them get to do heroic things, I guess.
Right. No, but I think that's always. I mean, remember Steve Rogers was the skinny guy who couldn't make it into the army, but he really wanted to go. Steve Blake or whoever turned into Thor, he walked with a cane and just stumbled upon the hammer, and so yeah, it was.
Thor has like a backstory like that. It's not just the regular Thor from mythology. I had no idea.
Oh yeah, in Marvel Comics, yeah, he was basically a semi-crippled doctor. Now I don't know if the movie Doctor Strange, if they sort of stole the Thor comic, because I don't know the origins of Doctor Strange in Marvel Comics, so it just seemed to me that the Doctor Strange movie was just a remake of Batman Begins. But that's all right. I mean, stories get repeated. It's sort of the point, even now. All right. I know you want to talk about Beauty and the Beast, and I think that, I mean, that and like The Little Mermaid, have to be two of the most popular fairy tales of all time. And mermaids were horrific things and evolved into, from, depending on who you believe, from various sources, into half women, half fish, and sometimes half men, half fish as well. But Beauty and the Beast was one that I threw Little Mermaid at it, but you pointed out Beauty and the Beast. So what's up with that?
So Beauty and the Beast was one of the first of these fairy tale stories that was written up by an identifiable author and then published. And it was published anonymously in 1740 in a French magazine. Its author was Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villanueva, which I think I have just pronounced in the Spanish way, not in the French way, but you get the idea.
No one's fact checking.
And she had put this story together from the stories that were told, that were folk stories that were told. And the story is very, very like the story of Cupid and Psyche from Greek mythology, which is very similar to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which you brought up a few minutes ago, I think. So we have all of these stories that share all of these different elements. In the story of Cupid and Psyche, Psyche is a young, beautiful woman, and she winds up marrying this mysterious man who comes to her at night and makes love to her. But he keeps a mask on the whole time and won't reveal his face. And she's initially very, enamored with this, but then she talks to her mother about it, and her mother tells her, well, you should be worried. This might be a demon behind this mask. And tells her at some point you should sneak in and try to catch a glimpse of him when he doesn't have his mask on. And she tries to do that. And it turns out that the man that she is married to has been visiting her every night is Cupid, the god, Eros, the god of love. The boy in Valentine's Day with the bow and arrow who shoots us in the heart and makes us fall in love with people. And he leaves her. He refuses to stay with her now that she has seen his face. So it's this sort of morality story, or this warning story about curiosity or looking too closely at things that seem too good to be true, maybe. Or maybe it's a warning about arranged marriage and or the dangers of arranged marriage. But anyway, I think it would be Villeneuve would probably be the French pronunciation of the name.
Yeah, I didn't want to tell you.
So in Villeneuve's version of the story, Beauty is the youngest child of a man who has many other sons and daughters, all of whom are attractive people, and he is initially very wealthy and well off, and then winds up losing all of his money in a bad investment. And they wind up having to move out to the country and live in this small cottage. It's all very, they've lost their status in the world and now have to adjust to this very different kind of life. It's the opposite of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But Beauty, who is, like her name, a beautiful young woman, resolves that she's also going to be a virtuous young woman, and she will be cheerful and get along with everyone and do good things and just be, all in all, like a good kid.
Right. The world is not going to get her down.
Right. The merchant, her father, at one point realizes or gets word that his ship literally has come in. He's had several trade ships out, and one of them has come into port and is maybe bringing in goods that will restore them to wealth. And he gets ready to go off and collect his things from the ship. And when he does, he asks the children if they want any particular gifts. And most of them they want clothing and jewels and fine dresses. But Beauty only wants that her father return safely, and that if he's going to bring her something, he should bring her a rose.
Aww.
So he arrives at the port to collect his items, and he discovers that all of his treasures that he was expecting are not there.
Oh.
They're not on board the ship. We don't know what's happened to them. And he decides that he's going to head home. And as he does, a storm comes up, very dangerous, sort of whiteout kind of snowstorm. And he needs to seek shelter. And he comes upon this fabulous mansion. And he goes inside, and he finds that inside there's a table that's groaning underneath plates of food and bottles of wine. It looks like someone is throwing a party for him, but there's no one there. And he decides, well, obviously I'm welcome here. And he sits down and he eats and he drinks and he falls asleep and just generally has a very nice night.
Totally not a trap.
Totally not a trap. As he's getting ready to leave, he looks out into the rose garden and he sees a lovely rose. And he decides that he's going to take it, even though this rose has not been offered him. So when he comes into the house, there's all of this stuff on the table for him to eat. He's a guest. He's he eats it. It's hospitality. But the rose has not been offered to him.
Right.
But he decides that he's going to take it anyway. And when he does, he suddenly is facing Beast. And we can call him that because that's the name that he's given in the story. He's just Beast. And Beast is furious with him for trying to steal the rose. This is, one of those stories, and the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah is probably somewhere at the bottom of this story. Which is a story about failures of the guest-host relationship. I mean, that was that was a sacred relationship. If you took guests into your home, you were supposed to treat them properly. If you were a guest in someone's home, you were supposed to behave properly. And here you have a guest who has stolen something from his host who's been very generous with him. So there's a violation of this very basic sort of compact.
Yeah, that's also big in Greek mythology, in Greek stories all over the place, and others as well. I mean, yeah, and so the rose was sort of the affront. Is although he did it with a pure heart, he knew that he was trespassing at that point.
Yeah, and there's also these stories are always there are always these things turning up that look on the face of them to be not that valuable or not that important, and then it turns out that in fact no, they're actually extremely valuable and extremely important. So the rose is going to turn out is very, very important.
What was Beast described in the original work?
I think he is described as being lion-like, and there are other stories. And if we get the chance to talk about the Bloody Chamber, there are variations of this story in which the host is a tiger, or like a literal tiger. So this lion tiger sort of creature maybe is in these stories because it's beastly, it's an animal, it's ferocious. But there's also a nobility about these animals. These animals are kind of exotic. They're not animals that you would find randomly in the forest. It seems like this creature in this story is lion-like.
Yes, king of the jungle, noble, big, strong, scary. I mean, it struck me. I didn't know this at the time, but now that I look at the image of the beast, and now that I've been doing the show, I mean, the beast fits into a couple of versions of the cherubim, how they were described, at least in certain prophecies description, which is also sort of lion-headed, bullish in body, and then, there's some eagle and man thrown in there too. I mean, I don't know if there was any eagle and beast either, but at least 3 out of the 4 in there, and it sounds like 2 here. Anyway, but I think point made. Big, scary, were animal thing.
Mm-hmm. Probably smelly, I mean, it's so the beast is ready to kill this man, and he begs and begs him and says, no, I've got kids at home, please don't kill me. Says, I only picked this rose because my daughter asked me for it. And the beast says, all right, you can go home, but only if you bring me back one of your daughters to live with me. So this is a negotiation for a marriage, for an arranged marriage. And the father gives in, says, sure.
Well, he's poor. He's got 7 kids. He probably was looking to, get one, and it's a good home with a monster, but it's, at least she'll be rich.
Well, he was in a situation where he theoretically could have made a heroic sacrifice and said, no, I'm not going to force one of my daughters to come back and live with you. You'll have to kill me. But that's not the choice that he made.
Isn't this the guy, he sort of always thinks his ship's going to come in? He's sort of like Adam Sandler in Uncut Gems.
Possibly. Yeah, I mean, this is the guy who always thinks that fate is going to work out for him. Just he needs one more turn of the wheel and everything is going to be better. And he's always buying time.
He's like Leto, one more.
And in fact, I think I think in the Angela Carter version of the story, I think that the father actually loses Beauty to the Beast in a card game. So there's just, there are certain archetypes of these characters, and this is one of them.
Right.
So
I get it.
He gets home. He sends Beauty to go live with the Beast, and she moves in. And Beast is actually very kind to her. He buys her like beautiful clothing, and he sets her up with servants and jewels, and according to Disney, lots and lots of books. And nevertheless, he is still a beast. And in the original story, and this is the part that does not appear in the children's stories, the Beast comes to her bedroom every night and begs to be allowed into her bed. And you have to, this is the part where you have to imagine what this would have been like in the moment. Right? I mean, if this story is being told to you and you are imagining yourself in the role of Beauty, you have to imagine that you're lying there in a dark room in your nightgown, and there's this big, hairy, smelly, probably drooling animal guy creature who is like looming over you and asking to sleep with you.
Right. He's got good manners. He is your husband, but still, it's a monster.
Yeah, that is a sacrifice that many of us would find difficult to make, I think. And she keeps telling him no.
Right. Sansa Stark was never faced with that with Tyrion. Tyrion was the beast, but he was genteel. He never asked her for anything. She said he was the best of all of her husbands.
Was she married? Oh yeah. I was thinking. I was thinking of the other one. With Theon? Was that what his name was?
Theon Greyjoy. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, they were never married.
No, he wanted to make time with his own sister. That was didn't even recognize her.
Well, and he paid a great price.
Yes. Yes, he did. Yeah. The less said about that, the better.
So she is, speaking of which, she tells him no every time, and to his credit, he leaves her alone. He does not force himself on her as some might have in, say, Game of Thrones.
And he's a gentle beast, just all the same.
She spends all of this time with him, and finally she begins to realize that she's very homesick and she wants to see her family again. And she begs for time to spend with her family. And Beast tells her, fine, go home if you must, but you have to come back within 2 months or he'll die of a broken heart.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the internal logic of fairy tales. You have to assume that it is possible that the Beast A has fallen in love with her, that and that B, he'll die of a broken heart, and C, that this will happen within 2 months for some reason.
Right.
And so Beauty goes home. She sees her family. Her family is all sort of telling her, "Hey, just stay here. Why are you going to go back there? Who cares if he dies? We're wealthy again," because the Beast had made their family wealthy in exchange for her going to live with them. And she gets to spend time living it up with her brothers and sisters again, and winds up staying a little bit longer than 2 months.
Oh.
And then she has a bad dream, and she dreams that the Beast is sort of lying there bereft and alone and dying, and she decides that she's going to race home to him, which she does. And she finds him near death, lying there on the ground, and she manages to bring him back to life by embracing him. And they get married. So again, we have this woman who is agreeing to marry this creature that she's been sort of sold off to in order to make her family rich. And they have a wedding ceremony, and she sleeps with him. She goes to bed with him that night. And it's the next morning. It's this. There's no romantic kiss like in the Disney cartoon. There's no petal falling off of a rose. What saves the beast is sex with Beauty. And when Beauty wakes up the next morning, she finds that he is now a prince, a handsome prince. So her being willing to sleep with him has transformed him back into his human self. And that's the story.
She pulled the old-fashioned reverse Shrek.
Mm-hmm.
all the old kiss the frog prince tale. Okay, well, good. Listen, that's a happy ending. She fell in love with him, or at least appreciated him enough and his decency that she was able to see past his beastliness for one night, and they consummated their love. And nice, very lovely. All right, Bloody Chamber.
Bloody Chamber. So Bloody Chamber is where it all gets, in fact, very bloody. And I really, if you were out there and listening to this and looking for something creepy to read, I can't recommend this collection of stories enough to you. It's really wonderful. And Chambers, I'm sorry, I keep wanting to call her Chambers. It's Carter, Angela Carter. She really just, she takes these old stories and she finds the bloody meat at the heart of them. So, one of her stories is The Company of Wolves, which some of you may have seen the film that was made of this story, which is a kind of a retelling of the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale. And in that fairy tale, which I'm sure you were familiar with, there's an innocent little girl who goes into the woods to see her grandmother. And when she arrives, there is, instead of her grandmother, a wolf in the bed dressed up in her grandmother's clothing. And the wolf is there because he has already eaten the grandmother and he's planning to eat Little Red Riding Hood. And Little Red Riding Hood is saved eventually by a huntsman who happens to appear, and so she's not made the wolf's dinner. But it's a story about not trusting strangers that you meet when you're alone in the woods, particularly if you're a little girl. But Carter's story takes those elements and resituates the power with this young woman. If it's okay, I thought I would read just a little teeny bit from this story, just like a paragraph or so, if that makes sense, because I want you to get a sense for kind of what the story sounds like and for how ingenious it is.
Sure, go right ahead.
It is midwinter, and the robin, the friend of man, sits on the handle of the gardener's spade and sings. It is the worst time in all the year for wolves, but this strong-minded child insists he will go off through the wood. She is quite sure the wild beasts cannot harm her, although, well warned, she lays a carving knife in the basket her mother has packed with cheeses. There is a bottle of harsh liquor distilled from brambles, a batch of flat oatcakes baked on the hearthstone, a pot or two of jam. The flaxen-haired girl will take these delicious gifts to a reclusive grandmother so old the burden of her years is crushing her to death. Granny lives 2 hours' trudge through the winter woods. The child wraps herself up in her thick shawl, draws it over her head. She steps into her stout wooden shoes. She is dressed and ready, and it is Christmas Eve. The malign door of the solstice still swings upon its hinges, but she has been too much loved ever to feel scared. So I don't want to give away sort of what happens in this story, but it is safe to say that the women and the girl characters in Carter's stories are often not innocent or not powerless or hopeless or unable to take care of themselves. And I think these stories are just sort of an example of the ways that these stories get rewritten over time to emphasize different elements, things that in their time or their place are thought to be more important or more worth thinking about. And these stories do that beautifully.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, I think, though, that she might have inadvertently started a nightmarish cascade of people rewriting tales from everyone's perspective, which started with the Three Little Pigs rewritten from the wolf's point of view, and then that led to the nightmare that continues right to this moment, which is Wicked. Or
there's the movies that are streaming now that are based on the characters that have entered the public domain, like the horror movies about Winnie the Pooh and Mickey Mouse, like the original Mickey Mouse.
All right, let me tell you something. That first Pooh movie was terrible. The second one, now I'm not saying it was a great work of art. I'm not saying it was a masterpiece, but it was a horror movie. You know, it was a slasher. It was a silly horror movie, but it was no worse than like Five Nights at Freddy's. The first one, unabashedly horrendous. Steamboat Willie, or whatever it was, Sleighboat Willie, or whatever it was called, terrible. Popeye the Slayer Man, haven't seen it yet. I plan on it. These are things I must do to myself at some point. I finally got around to watching Land of the Lost, the movie. Long-time listeners of this show know that I had convinced myself that there was deep meaning to the TV show, and no, of course there was. And I had this whole panel, and we sort of gave up midway because we're all like, it was hard to coordinate our schedules, and we're like, yeah, this movie is just like old stoners made this stupid show. Well, the new one. If you want a quick recommendation, there were parts that I laughed at. I probably shouldn't have laughed at. There were parts I laughed that I should have, but overall, terrible movie. But there was at least one point where I was laughing so hard that I couldn't breathe. Some of the jokes are just dated and you can't tell them anymore. But some of them are just bad, you know. But anyway, enough about that.
Can we close with one more poem?
Yeah, let's get off Land of the Lost. Yeah.
Okay.
But there was a big reinterpretation of Marshall, Will, and Holly, though. I will say that.
No, I didn't. I never really watched the TV show, so I don't know these characters.
You don't have to, and you're welcome.
Okay. Okay. So I want to close with one more poem. Because I love the idea of bringing poetry to people who might not go out looking for it every day, because I love poetry, and I hope that other people will share my love of it with me, but also because this poem encapsulates all of these sorts of themes, or many of these themes that we've been talking about today, these anxieties about power and replacement and youth and beauty. And it's a poem called 3510 by Sharon Olds. And it's a poem from, I think, the 1980s. It's been around a good long time. Sharon Olds obviously has had an extraordinary career, won the Pulitzer a couple of years ago. 3510. Brushing out my daughter's dark silken hair before the mirror, I see the gray gleaming on my head, the silver-haired servant behind her. Why is it just as we begin to go, they begin to arrive? The fold in my neck clarifying as the fine bones of her hips sharpen. As my skin shows its dry pitting, she opens like a small pale flower on the tip of a cactus. As my last chances to bear a child are falling through my body, the duds among them, her full purse of eggs, gold and firm as hard-boiled yolks, is about to snap its clasp. I brush her tangled, fragrant hair at bedtime. It's an old story, the oldest we have on our planet, the story of replacement.
Is that our wedding day?
Could be.
Could be. Well, sad for. See, I don't have daughters, so I feel like I was sort of spared that whole thing. or was robbed of that whole thing, whichever way you want to look at it. But yeah, very, very nice. It's always good to have you here to class up the joint, to spruce up the garden, to plant some, robust, classy, expensive flowers in our miasma here, in our bayou. Okay. So if you want to be found and followed and have people buy your books and stuff, or maybe hire you as a lawyer, maybe they want an advocate in prose that can do the Canterbury Tales, but to the Court of Appeals, how would people find you?
I might have put a reference to the Odyssey in an appellate brief earlier this year.
As you should have.
You can find me at JenniferASutherland.com. You can find my books, a link to buy my books there. You can also find my books with my press at riverriverbooks.com, .org. Or you can find my books at Amazon or Bookshop or Barnes & Noble, anywhere good literature is sold.
Excellent. Thank you very much. While we were talking, there were so many songs that popped in my head. Shoot That Poison Arrow by ABC. There were a few others, but I think I settled on Duran Duran, Hungry Like the Wolf. I think that's covered all.
I think that's perfect.
I think that covered a whole lot of it. So good. I'm glad you agree. All right. Well, folks, you might already be hearing the dulcet tones of Duran Duran, classic 1980s. I was in high school, when it came out, and there we go. Do you remember that painter was who made all there was all the art, and it was all on the Duran Duran fashion albums, and they became really famous for 5 years, the artist, and they sort of disappeared?
I know who you're talking about, but I can't think what the person's name is.
Yeah, me either. All right. Well, that was good. Maybe I should edit that out, but I won't. All right, folks. Thanks for coming into the garden. Thank you, Jennifer, for being a wonderful guest as always. Folks, if you are one of Jennifer's big fans, she says she doesn't have big fans. I don't know if that means in number or just size, but either one, if you're here because you're Jennifer's fan, thank you. Welcome. This is Garden of Thought. Please subscribe, follow, or just hit Marcus Played. It's fine. It's okay. You don't even have to listen if you don't want to. But I would prefer that people listen because you do get the meanderings of a lunatic. That would be me. And then you get the intentional words of a smart guest. That would be Jennifer this week. And hopefully that's an entertaining combination for some. And hey, listen, now you can think of Job and Exodus, remind you of the Odyssey at all. And you can let me know. Anyway, Garden of Thought, wherever podcasts are found, you'll get 2 to 3 shows per week. Some are like this. Some are very different. Some will have a co-host that's a professional wrestler, and we'll talk to someone else in wrestling. We'll try to get away from wrestling, but we always use it as an icebreaker or a crutch. And, sometimes it takes over. Other times, not at all. All right, everyone, kept you long enough, kept Jennifer long enough. Duran Duran coming. See you next time.